what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the application of ecological site descriptions to land restoration. In a little bit, as more of an introductory talk to the really sort of technical stuff that that Tams and Patty have put together in this symposium, and just kind of set a little bit of context, and that I hope will help people interpret what we see later during the symposium. First and foremost, I always want to start with this, is why ecological sites matter. And ecological sites matter because we use them for land management decisions. If we don't use ecological site descriptions for land management decisions, what's the point? So, you know, I think, and we've done a pretty good job so far, but I kind of see us occasionally having a tendency to veer off into the more academic applications of this, and we certainly don't want to do that. Our goal is to provide tools that are useful in land management, and I would even go so far to say is that our ultimate goal is to really get to the point where most people that use ecological site descriptions don't even know that they're ecological site descriptions. They get the information when they need it. So a little bit of pedantism here. An ecological site is a conceptual division of a landscape. An ecological site description is the term of the documentation that supports those characteristics of that site and the use and management interpretations. And generally, and this is kind of where I want to focus in, at least on the first part of this talk, is we work at that component level. And when we talk about an ecological site description, we are talking about a component in that land resource hierarchy, in that soil survey terminology. There's some really important concepts, and you know, if you don't understand these concepts and you don't understand how they work in terms of application in the field, you really shouldn't be using ecological sites and ecological site information, because what we know and how we apply them through the National Cooperative Soil Survey and our understanding of soils really is what constrains what we do with ecological site information. It's the thing that tells us when we should use it, and just as importantly, it's the thing that tells us when we shouldn't use that ecological site. So really important concepts, and this is all out of the Soil Survey Manual. It's available online. The next to the most boring document ever written in the history of the world. The most boring is soil taxonomy. We have climatic, geological, and biological factors that produce landscape scale patterns. Those patterns are the basis for soil identification and mapping at vastly different scales. And remember that, always remember that, we are working across multiple scales when we work with soils information and ecological site information. We don't have them easily accessible anymore. For those of you who never saw an old printed soil survey manuscript, right up at the front was the soil landscapes, the soil block diagrams. These were incredibly helpful, even in places where we didn't have ecological sites or in the old days range sites. These things are incredibly helpful because they tell you how the landscape's put together. And within each of these landscape components, there's some soil associations there. And I'll get to what a soil association is. So in soil survey terminology, a map unit is a collection of areas defined and named in the terms of their soil components. Map units are designed to meet the needs of major users. And a map unit has specified kinds of soil or miscellaneous components. So we are talking about components. Map units are composed of components, and they are designed. We don't really have a quantitative definition for how to design a map unit. Once we've designed it, we can assign quantitative properties to it, and that way we can interpret those properties, but we don't have hard and fast rules about what a map unit is. We have to take into account user needs, and projections about the intensity of land use in a particular area. Those definitions from the world's most boring document. Now, ecological sites are linked to soil map unit components. If you go out to the field and you've got a published soil survey, or you go on Soil Web and you download the information on the mobile device, it'll tell you which map unit you're on. That's not good enough. That map unit has a description of what components are in it. Ecological sites are linked to components, or soil series phases in the taxonomy terminology. So it's possible that we have, within a given map unit, which is the smallest thing that we can define on a map, we can cut out before we go out there, within that map unit, we've got multiple components. And in this particular case, this is a pretty good one, because in that stellar association, we've got 40% stellar clay loam, which is a clay ecological site, and we've got 40% stellar clay loam flooded, which is bottomland site. And then we've got 20% of other inclusions. So if you only take that map unit out there, you say, which map unit am I on, in either hard copy or digitally, there's a 60% chance that where you are standing is not the map unit that's been described. Or I'm sorry, it's not the component that's been described. You could be on a different soil than has been assigned to these ecological sites. So the first thing that you have to do when you're talking about using an ecological site description for land restoration is make sure you're on the site that you think you're on, and the site for which you've selected the state and transition model to use. So does anybody know how to verify which site you're on? All right, that's it. Okay. 3 words is all you need to know. And fortunately for us, there are no alternatives. If you really are really good and you spent your entire career in one little spot, you might be able to get it most of the time, but those are the people that would actually tell you, dig a hole. So I think, we need, in our ecological sites, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later at more length, is we need diagnostics to make sure, both in terms of where we are in space and where we are in time, that we are where we think we are. And we need diagnostics to confirm that. We can't just assume that because it says it in that site description or it says that in that soil survey map, that's where we are. So we've got all these different possibilities out there. A soil map unit can contain more than one ecological site. In some cases, they are substantially different, and in many, many cases, they are different enough that you would make different decisions based on those different ecological sites, especially about restoration. An ecological site groups several components together. So these are some complex relationships, and until we acknowledge these relationships and we make sure that we deal with these relationships in a systematic fashion, we're always going to have trouble getting the right information on the ground at the right time. So if we want to sort of sum up the spatial domain part of it, I think soil maps are a good guide to the application of ecological site concepts and interpretation. But it's unlikely that current soil maps are sufficiently precise to apply, assess, and evaluate restoration technologies. And that's assuming that the restoration technologies that we're using are, they're going to be difficult. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be restoration. And they're going to be expensive and they're going to be risky. And if we're going to realistically assess the risk associated with these restoration technologies, we really have to pay a lot more attention to where we are in both space and time. So if we look at the other part of that spatio-temporal continuum, we start out with the spatial domain, the ecological site, dig a hole, all right, where we know where we are. Where are we in time? What temporal domain are we in? This is where the state and transition models come in. We're at the point where we have we've defined ourselves temporally, we've defined ourselves spatially, we're pretty confident where we are. Really, you've only got 2 choices if you're out on the ground. And in a conservation decision-making sense, Are you going to maintain what's out there? Are you happy with what's out there? It may be giving you what you want. There's a set of ecosystem services that are associated with that spatial temporal domain. If you like them, stick with them. That state and transition model and that ecological site description should tell you which practices, in detail, which practices you need to apply to maintain those ecological processes and those ecosystem services that support that state. There should be also monitoring prescriptives or monitoring prescriptions that go along with that, with some structured feedback. If we don't care enough about an ecological site description and a state and transition model to actually write into the thing what it is that we're doing and what we should expect to see, and then what we're going to do to monitor it, and then go back out there and say, did it work? And then put that back into the system in a structured format, then why should we do it in the first place? The other choice that you've got is, okay, I want to do something different. I have a desired alternative state. So over here you've got a list of alternatives. They could be many or few. And within each of those alternatives, you've got the same set of choices. You've got some ecological processes that you want to support, or you want to speed up, or you want to slow down in some cases. You've got a set of ecosystem services that those ecological processes should help deliver. You've got a set of practices that go with that. And when I'm talking about practices, I'm talking about quantitative recommendations. Prescribed grazing in a state and transition model is not particularly helpful when you're trying to make a decision, especially a decision about a state change. Same thing. Those are practices, structured feedback based on monitoring, based on indicators that we can assess, plug back into the system and say, did this work? If it did work, great. Reinforce that idea. If it didn't, then we should be changing it. Okay, so let's talk about ecological site application to conservation planning. These are pretty well accepted ideas, I think. The ecological states represent the range of possibilities. Once you've determined your spatial domain, your spatial temporal domain, you've got a couple of choices. You pick one of those choices. I'm here, I want to be here. Apparently, I don't want to be on that slide. Okay, the transitions provide a link to ecological processes, climatic conditions. Are you doing that? And those conservation practices and systems are linked to those transitions. So we're here, we want to be here. What is it that we need to do? Specifically, what is it we need to do? If we don't get specific in these things, we will not improve them. So what we're working on is an idea called rule-based ecological site development, starting at the major land resource area, MLRAs, and then focusing on ecological processes and saying what ecological processes are we interested in that drive those changes. Then devolving those into rules for classification and developing a systematic, structured approach to state and transition models that will let us go look at those transitions and say, what's the ecological process of interest and what's the reversibility of that practice? How do we go about doing it? What do we want to do and how do we go about doing it? And ultimately getting that down to a quantitative prescription that somebody can follow and, more importantly, somebody can evaluate and somebody can test that model with that data. These are hypotheses. Okay, we've just recently undertaken an initiative to correlate ecological site concepts at the MLRA and LRU scales. Going through the existing site descriptions that we have in our databases, we are nowhere near where we need to be with consistency and being systematic. We've got a lot of different things. We've got components grouped into soil or into ecological sites that are all over the place. We've got ecological sites assigned to multiple components. We're just in the state where we need to clean up the databases, and we need to make sure that we are internally consistent so that if we do decide to change something, we know how to actually go about changing it. Essentially what we'll be doing is we'll be working, like I said, we start over here with the components that are the level at which ecological sites are defined. We're going to start working up in this area. We're going to start making sure that we have the concepts that underlie MLRAs. What is it that makes that outline that separates one MLRA from the other? What is it that makes that thing unique, and what is it that drives the vegetation dynamics, the ecosystem processes, and the ecological processes within those MLRAs? Those can be broken down in many cases to land resource units, a little more tightly defined. And then finally, groups of ecological sites. So we're really sort of looking at putting a lot more emphasis in this part of that hierarchy and making sure that when we do start applying it at this level, we've got a firm foundation for doing that. So this is kind of a workflow. This is going to be new for a lot of people. The guidance on this is coming out in the next week or so. But this is the workflow for ecological sites. For the next 5 years, we're going to focus on developing provisional ecological sites. Those ecological sites are going to be at the MLRA scale. We are going to complete MLRAs in total. If we don't get the level of precision that we want as we get to an approved site, or we don't have the level of evidence collected and documentation that we want, then we'll pick that up afterwards. But we've got to get this part done to ensure that the concepts that we're using and the approach that we're using is correct. Otherwise, we'll be back down here trying to figure out what we didn't do up here. And then ultimately, we want to get down to where these ecological sites within an MLRA are all correlated. They fit together nicely, including the interpretations. So if we think that precipitation is the main driver behind forage production and harvest levels are controlled by our ability to exploit a landscape, all the rules that we develop at higher levels filter down to an individual ecological site, and they're consistent. If they're not consistent, we should be able to figure out why. This is not to say that we're going to try to make everything uniform, but we have to be able to identify why things don't fit, and if they don't fit, is it important? So that is almost the end of my talk. Applying ecological concepts to land restoration using ecological site descriptions. The soil and ecological site maps that we currently have lack the spatial precision to serve as a basis for evaluating risk. And when we're talking about restoration, I think we always need to come at it from a risk standpoint. What's the risk associated with what we want to do, and what's the benefit of that it works? Improving success requires site-specific confirmation and assessment. We know how to do that. A more consistent approach to state and transition models, we are learning how to do that. And then finally, more precision in the description of ecological processes, a more quantitative approach to describing the ecological processes, the practices that are applied either to maintain or to change, and what are the indicators that we can measure to see if what we've done really is working. Thank you.